Ines folded his hands on the table, making a show of giving Baroness Zaradnik's query plenty of serious thought. No, it wasn't as if he wasn't giving it serious thought, it was just that nothing came of it no matter how much he tried. Even in his previous existence as Suzuki Satoru, rules favored the rulers and justice was merely a word. Arguments between Albert and Touchme were about as much exposure as he had to it. Albert in particular would go on about the injustice of the world, and his fellow guild members grew concerned when his real-world gripes started to blend with his evil online persona. He suspected that the Baroness would be markedly unimpressed by Albert's views on the matter. Touchme often pointed out that Albert's ideas on justice were little more than romantic notions that revolved around ignorant opinions on fairness. The Baroness, on the other hand, sought practical solutions to the societal issues faced by the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Ines's nebulous concept of justice bounced around in his empty skull as non-existent drops of sweat formed on the equally non-existent skin of his brow. He was supposed to be the king, yet he felt like his old salaryman self being questioned by a company executive. Unable to come up with anything that might impress the Baroness, he resorted to the default tactic of salesman since time immemorial, asked leading questions until he identified something to turn to his advantage. His eyes went to Aura and Mare, whose eyes shone with their expectations for his answer. For the benefit of Aura and Mare here, he said, we should walk through how we may come up with a realistic framework through which the Sorcerer's Kingdom's justice is upheld. I would hate it if they grow up thinking that such monumental systems are arbitrarily derived. Of course, Your Majesty, the young noblewoman smiled. Yosh. Lady Zaradnik seemed to have a soft spot for children, so Ines figured she would readily agree. As a result, he had gained an extra layer of defense against her scrutiny. If things went well, he might even be able to learn something useful. To begin with, the Baroness said, what is the root of justice? Everything that Ines Summer says is right. That's right, Aura nodded. Ines Summer can't possibly be wrong. Ines resisted the urge to bury his face in his palm as his plan immediately went awry. Now, he said, I've told you many times before that even I can make mistakes. Zaradnik Dono, why don't you get us started on the right foot? Yes, Your Majesty. The root of justice is nature. A species' instincts, behavior, and place in the environment act as the baseline for what is perceived as positive or negative, what is relatable and what one empathizes with. In other words, the foundation of morality is dependent on the nature of a race. Morality, in turn, is foundational to one's sense of justice. Even in the most primitive of tribal societies, there is a sense of right and wrong shared by the entire community. What one should and shouldn't do becomes codified into rudimentary law. As order establishes itself, so does the social contract. This social contract tends to be upheld by the judiciary of a government, whether it be a council or tribal elders or the high court of an empire. And this is why it's so difficult for different races to get along, Ines said. You mentioned the justice of sheep being detrimental to wolves. Indeed, Lady Zaradnik replied. Aristides and the Empire provide many examples of how human justice, I suppose most races would consider it the justice of sheep deals with other races. Entire institutions are created to remove what are perceived as threats to human life and economic productivity. Such as the Adventurer Guild, Ines said. Or the Imperial Army. Baroness Zaradnik nodded. There is a painfully obvious bias in human countries when it comes to interactions with species other than their own. Aristides and the Empire went to war every year, yet they still host each other's embassies, trade with one another openly, and even share family ties. Compare that to their mutual reaction to a tribe of goblins living in the wilderness beyond their borders. As frontier nobles, Ines said, shouldn't your family have existed at the forefront of that thinking? In my experience, the Baroness replied, it tends to be the opposite. People from the heartlands and especially the cities tend to react more poorly to interactions with wilderness tribes. I suppose it is because all of the exciting tales that they hear instill them with certain preconceptions. Yet the wilderness tribes do attack, Ines noted. Raids along the frontier are not merely tales spun by bards for entertainment. And those are mostly the result of two forms of justice coming into conflict. House Saradnik survived for as long as it did not because it prevailed over every tribe it contended with, but because it developed an understanding of tribal justice. Through that understanding, we could prevent most conflicts before they happened. But didn't we just say that different forms of justice make it so that people can't get along? Aura asked. The ghost of a smile touched the young noblewoman's lips. Yes, my lady, she answered. At the same time, it is from our relationship with our tribal neighbors that I gained my first hints as to how proper justice might be established in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Through countless interactions over the centuries, a rudimentary sense of shared customs has been established in the area. A moral thread that determines what is acceptable and what the consequences for crossing certain lines are. How did you use it to defend your area? Mare asked. It informed us as to how we should act to minimize overly violent incidents with the tribes. One wouldn't be wrong to say that we adopted the same code of justice to survive. We were the outsiders when it came to that, after all. I see, Ainz stroked his chin thoughtfully. So by conforming to the overarching culture of the tribes and thus drawing a relation to their sense of justice, it made things easier for your people to function on the frontier. This was one of the basics of adult society. New employees conformed to workplace culture or they would have a difficult time surviving. Now that the Baroness had defined the roots of justice, Ainz could see workplace culture as being similar to tribal justice. There were all sorts of unwritten rules beyond the letter of the law, and everyone just went along with the punishments should some unfortunate soul violate one of them. It is hardly a novel concept, Lady Saradnik said. The problem is that few consider adopting what they might consider alien or primitive. People are more likely to throw around terms like barbarism and savagery than they are to give any serious thought into how and why things work the way that they do. But why do we have to conform to how other people do things? Aura asked. They just have to do what Ainz Summer tells them to and there won't be any problems. Is that an elf's perspective on the matter, Lady Aura? It should be everyone's perspective, Aura replied. People who don't listen to Ainz Summer should be punished. Beside Aura, Mare nodded in agreement. The Baroness placed her hands on the table, staring silently at the books and notes spread out along its length. Justice that does not serve the people tends to result in tragedy, Lady Saradnik said. The civilization that we have been studying for the past few days is an example of this. Is this the type of society your Majesty desires? There must be hundreds of books in the Great Library covering their history. Absolutely not, Ainz's answer was immediate. If anything, I would prefer that we avoid their situation entirely. That is a relief to hear, the young noblewoman smiled and turned her attention back to Aura and Mare. Now, based on what we have learned of this civilization, how would you describe the form of their justice? Aura and Mare hummed for a few moments. Though he had a lot to say as someone who had to exist in the civilization that they were studying, he refrained from answering the question out of a creeping worry that he might end up sounding like Ulbert on one of his rants. The rulers were strong, Aura said, so the people had to go along with whatever they decided. They controlled pretty much everything, Mare added, then frowned. But I don't understand why that's bad. If Ainz Summer did all that, wouldn't it be good? Maybe it's bad because they weren't Ainz Summer, Aura ventured. The Baroness glanced at Ainz again. It wasn't his fault that the NPCs were so fanatically loyal to him, but he still felt guilty whenever she received one of their arbitrary answers. How about we consider things from the perspective of the common citizens? Lady Saradnik said. Ainz Summer can do whatever he wants to me, Mare said as he bounced enthusiastically on his chair. Imaginary sirens blared in Ainz's head. He cleared his non-existent throat, acting to prevent something from happening. He wasn't sure what would happen, but it surely wouldn't be good in various ways. Saradnik Dono is asking how the common citizens feel about how society treats them, he said. Whether their basic needs are met, the availability of opportunities, and so on. MMH, it looked like the people who followed the rules got enough food to survive. It didn't sound very tasty though. If they wanted better food, Aura said, they should have followed Ain's summer instead. I can't win. No matter how he twisted and turned, the NPCs seemed to always find ways to express their unwavering loyalty. This time, Suzuki Satoru's meager savings were instantly vaporized as collateral damage. While poorly trained administrators may consider sustenance as a mere quota to be fulfilled, Lady Zaradnik said, its quality can have an outsized effect on the public sentiment and its value is not limited to enjoyment. Consider the quagga, for instance. They can consume iron, copper, and other common metals, but what their offspring can become is dependent on what they are fed. Therefore, the availability of quality food weighs far more heavily on a quagga population's opinion of their quality of life. But the Sorcerer's Kingdom's quagga mostly eat common metals. Ainz crossed his arms. For the time being, the Sorcerer's Kingdom largely depends on imports for ore and metalwork in general, mostly from the dwarves. I promised prosperity to them when they submitted to my rule, but, as a country, the Sorcerer's Kingdom can't realistically provide adamantite to every quagga. Yes, Your Majesty, Lady Zaradnik nodded. As a country, the Sorcerer's Kingdom cannot realistically provide mithril, never mind adamantite to every quagga household. Nor should it. While we call it a social contract, it is more flexible than any formal contract between parties. Within it, amongst other things, are harbored the expectations for security, opportunity, and overall quality of life. In exchange, those who choose to participate in that particular society are expected to observe its laws and customs. People compare one social contract against another, though they likely do not frame it as such, to determine where their best prospects lie. So all we have to do is be better than anyone else? Aura said, that's easy. The Sorcerer's Kingdom is already the best country in the world. Because Ain's summer is here, added Mare. While we may agree on that, Lady Zaradnik said, others will not. You do bring up a good point, however. Emotional and economic investment in one's current home may heavily skew how one feels about it. Similarly, those factors will influence things like trade and foreign relations for outsiders. Aura's expression soured. Foreign relations? I thought we were supposed to be talking about the justice of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Since His Majesty wishes for amicable relations with both members of our hegemony and those beyond our immediate sphere of influence, it is something that we must consider. Unfortunately, the Sorcerer's Kingdom will most likely fail to appeal to everyone. I.e. not going to fail Ain's summer. For what reasons do you predict failure? Ainz asked. The Baroness took 2 books from the nearby piles on the table, placing each under one hand. One looked like it was one of Blue Planet's crazy books while the other was a proper history of Earth. Irreconcilable differences between value systems and the resulting clashes of culture and justice are not restricted to relations between a country and its tribal neighbors. The more steps we take toward realizing Your Majesty's wishes for the Sorcerer's Kingdom, the more solid of a target different aspects of our society will be for those who disagree with them. That isn't necessarily a problem for us, is it? Ainz said, it's unreasonable to expect every country to be the same. It is as Your Majesty says, Lady Zaradnik replied. Unfortunately, tolerance is unlikely to solve many of the problems that come with having such neighbors. If they attack us, Aura said, then we'll squish 'em. Few would be so straightforward with their convictions if they are aware of the Sorcerer's Kingdom's martial might. The temples of the 4 in our region are a good example of how future problems might play out. Rather than attack us directly, they use their influence over the people, creating cultural, economic, and political barriers. As a result, our overall progress in the empire is many times slower than it should be. Strategically speaking, it is the most efficient way to resist us. If the temples incited violence against the Sorcerer's Kingdom or the Imperial administration, they would give us the justification to intervene and Lady Albedo would not waste any time purging undesirable elements. Is this going to happen everywhere? I believe the reaction to the Sorcerer's Kingdom's opening moves as the regional hegemon is a fair example of what we will encounter abroad, the Baroness said. We will have pragmatic groups like the wilderness tribes whose societal paradigms make submitting to strength the obvious choice. Identifying and capitalizing on existing crises can also help us cut through bureaucracy and address erroneous preconceptions that may otherwise take years or decades to dispel. Others, like the Empire, may peacefully become members of our hegemony and slowly adapt to their new circumstances. And what of those who refuse to get along? Ines asked. Aristais has known of our existence for about as long as the Baharuth Empire has, yet there is little sign of progress with them on the diplomatic front. The Baroness folded her hands on the table, her gaze becoming unfocused. Despite both being neighboring human countries that have many cultural parallels, she said after a few moments, it is hardly fair to measure our relationship with both countries by the same standard. In the case of the Baharuth Empire, Your Majesty brilliantly won the Emperor over through what must have been an act to surpass even the legends of old. Since the Empire had become so highly centralized with little to keep the sovereign's power in check, it meant that the entire country would come over to our side, as well. While the young woman spoke, Ines silently prayed that she wouldn't ask what exactly it was that he did because he didn't know himself. He had gone to Arwinter to promote the Sorceress Kingdom's new adventurer guild and came back with a client state instead. Aristais, on the other hand, the Baroness continued, is still very much a kingdom where checks and balances would keep House Vaisel from doing the same thing. One would not only have to win over the royal family, but each noble house, as well. It would be far easier to woo individual nobles to our side than it would be to take the kingdom in one piece. That being said, our strategy in Re-Estais is entirely different from what happened with the Empire. Shouldn't the trouble we're having with Re-Estais mean that similarities between societies don't help them get along? Mare asked. Ines Summer said that we should use the laws of Re-Estais. By your logic, human countries should be more friendly to us. It may seem that way from our perspective, my lord, Lady Zaradnik answered, but the fact of the matter is that the kingdom of Re-Estais does not recognize us as a human country. Neither does the Baharuth Empire, for that matter. We are still considered a land overrun by undead and demons by the people of both. But we're not. The truth matters little in this regard. What matters is what people think is true. I fear that we will be facing a similar set of challenges wherever we find ourselves. Isn't that a bad thing? It is what it is. What matters is that we face those challenges and develop solutions for them. Now, back to the domestic side of things. As a member of the royal court, how would my lady propose to uphold the justice of the Sorceress Kingdom? Make laws, I guess? Aura said. That is one available avenue, the Baroness nodded. How would you structure those laws? Forget devising punishments for the time being. I want to know the rules and measures through which you will guide the citizens of the Sorceress Kingdom, forming the society that His Majesty desires. Huh? What's with this difficulty, Spike? They had gone from discussing the building blocks of society and its effect on foreign relations straight to molding the character of a civilization. Wasn't her question too complex for children? He was lucky she hadn't turned to him for the answer right then and there. Everyone seems to think that killing your own people is bad, Aura said. Let's go with that, first. That's right, Mare nodded. If people are dead, they can't pay taxes to Ines Summer. The relationship between population and productivity is indeed something that governments tend to focus on, Lady Zaradnik said. Not only does a person dying mean that their contributions to society are cut short, but the investment that went into their development is no longer generating returns. In the guild system, the average time it takes an apprentice to graduate to journeyman is 6 years. If said journeyman is murdered in an alley shortly after they graduate, the 6 years invested is a complete loss. Not only that, a government's investments into maintaining the infrastructure and security similarly go unrewarded as far as that individual is concerned. The more technically demanding a job is and the more complex and expansive a country's systems are, the higher the cost to develop the population becomes. Does that mean it's worth it to resurrect people who are valuable enough? Mare asked. I imagine that countries with access to resurrection magic do exactly that, the Baroness answered. Now, by implementing a law against killing citizens, you have created another problem. The citizens who would normally prey on your other citizens have been denied their usual source of food. From their perspective, you have implemented an unjust law. They can buy food from the market. Aura said. How can they afford food from the market? By working. Isn't that obvious? Yes and no, the young noblewoman said. The line of thinking that you just used is common amongst urbanites, but it is a woefully insufficient answer for a ruler. To purchase food from the markets, that food needs to be procured in some manner. To find work, there must be demand for one's capabilities in some productive activity, and the rewards for participating as a functional member of society must outweigh the alternatives. I've caused a lot of trouble for everyone. As he thought about his thoughtlessness, Ines felt like disappearing under the table. As far as his policies on employment went, it was just a vague suggestion that everyone should do what they were good at. It never occurred to him that, even if someone was good at something, it didn't necessarily mean that there was a demand for it. Even if there initially was, adding millions of demi-humans to the labor market surely meant it wasn't the case any longer. His notions on trade were similar. When he had gone to negotiate with the Azalisian mountain dwarves, he proposed that the agricultural produce rapidly stockpiling in the Sorcerous Kingdom could be traded for ores and metalwork produced by the dwarves. This was out of a desire to maximize Nazaric's income from the Sorcerous Kingdom's agricultural production. He hadn't given any thought whatsoever as to whether his subjects would be able to eat. In other words, despite his intention of creating a harmonious, prosperous country that everyone could admire, he had become no better than a corrupt, untouchable ruler who exploited his people for his house's gain. The only reason people outside of Nazarick didn't notice was because they assumed that the funds and resources collected through taxes and rent went to the national budget and had no way of knowing otherwise. The lack of transparency itself violated the laws that they imposed on everyone else. Rules for rulers, indeed. No, it can't be that bad, can it? On that note, Zaradnik Dono, Ines said, how do you think the Sorcerer's Kingdom has fared on that front? Say, through our relationship with the dwarves. Just the dwarves, Your Majesty? Let's keep things simple for Aura and Mare's sake. Very well. Broadly speaking, I believe that we have established a mutually beneficial relationship that should serve as a model for future diplomacy with small countries. I see, Ines nodded sagely. Is there anything in particular that you like about it? Attributing the benefits to any single aspect would not do the whole justice, so I will try to be as concise as possible. Imports of ore and refined metals to the Sorcerous Kingdom have stimulated many industries. Most notably are those related to transportation and logistics, which will be essential in the future. How has the Sorcerous Kingdom benefited? Only a handful of houses were ready to fully capitalize on the unexpected initiation of diplomacy and trade with the dwarves, namely House Corlin, House Wagner, and House Gonnier. I also invested what I could at Countess Corlin's urging. Due to this, our combined interests control the majority of land trade based in the Sorcerous Kingdom as well as all of its maritime trade. Ines flinched as the Albert in his heart spit on him. Not only was he a comically corrupt ruler, but he had created a cadre of cronies who controlled huge chunks of the country and its economy. Pereroncino appeared as well, but he mentally waved everyone away before he spouted something Pereroncino-like. What of the people themselves? Ines asked. When a noble speaks of their house in this context, the Baroness answered, it generally refers to the house's subjects as well. They are all part of the same establishment, after all. If Your Majesty is asking about the population as a whole, the best way to describe what is going on is to outline the demographic shifts happening in the kingdom. The territories in the south and east are leading these shifts, again those of the houses I mentioned just now, along with the capital. Growth in industries related to transportation and logistics has fueled a demand for skilled labor. Humans, who are suited for the pure job class builds favored by these industries, are flocking to both the government-run technical schools and traditional guild establishments to pursue careers in those fields. The jobs that they leave behind, which are mostly physical labor, are being snapped up by much stronger or more resilient demi-humans. Won't that create a problem wherein demi-humans are looked down upon? That depends on the resident culture, Your Majesty, Baroness Saradnik replied. Followers of the Sikhs do not believe that any one vocation has inherently greater value over any other, so one will not experience any notions of the sort of pecking order in the Southern Territories unless an outsider brings the idea of it in with them. Elsewhere, however, it may be as Your Majesty says unless an active effort is made to curb such behaviors. This is a problem not caused by Your Majesty's maneuvering in the Dwarf Kingdom, however, it is one inherited through the culture of the northern human countries. In conclusion, Your Majesty's decision to initiate relations with the Azalisian mountain dwarves can only be seen as the move of a ruler with inscrutable foresight, laying solid groundwork for the Sorceress Kingdom's future ambitions in so many ways that I suspect that we will not realize the full scope of Your Majesty's grand vision for decades to come, if ever. Ugh, my stomach hurts. Across the table, Aura and Mare's mouths were open in wide smiles, their eyes shining with unadulterated awe and admiration. Ainz couldn't decide whether knowing or not knowing the precise details of his supposed genius was worse. Now, Lady Saradnik said, we have been so kindly guided to the next topic and its effect on the perceived justness of a society. Lord Mayor, Lady Aura, are you ready to hear more of His Majesty's wisdom? Yeah. Aura cheered. Mayor nodded. I can go all night long. Excellent, the Baroness smiled. With so many exciting things to learn from His Majesty, I am sure that the many hours to come will simply fly by. Ainz Summer. A heavy malaise hung over Ainz Ul Gown, supreme overlord of the great tomb of Nazarick, sovereign of the Sorceress Kingdom, and the man who had recently been made aware of how clueless he was about running a country. Not that he ever thought himself good at it. He knew he was bad, that was why he left the task to others, after all, but not that bad. Caught in a trap of his own making, Ainz had little choice but to spend the entire night in the great library of Ashurbanipal as Baroness Saradnik explored His Majesty the Sorcerer King's mastery of societal engineering with Aura and Mare. He never realized how much work the Sorcerer King supposedly put into guiding his subjects to the bright and shining future he had promised them. All he could remember was skimming through the paperwork that Albedo brought to him and making futile attempts to understand what was going on before giving up and putting his seal on each document. Perhaps the most concerning thing was that, even as Ainz struggled to follow what the Baroness was saying, Aura and Mare seemed to have few issues keeping up. The more the trio delved into the endless depths of the Sorcerer King's alleged wisdom, the more empty Ainz felt his head was. Reportedly, the twins spent quite a lot of time with the young noblewoman, at least as far as their interactions with the natives went, so perhaps they had gained the prerequisite knowledge to understand her terrifyingly complex analysis during previous discussions. His bruised and battered mind and ego aside, Ainz figured it was a good thing. As it was with Shaltir, Lady Saradnik seemed to be a good influence on Aura and Mare. While he rarely worried for the twins' physical safety as they went about their daily routines, he was worried that a friend might latch onto them to take advantage of their power or influence. They were still innocent children, after all. Ainz Summer? The crimson points of light in his eye sockets flared to life. Is something the matter? Forgive me for interrupting your thoughts, Ainz Summer, Sabos' voice issued from the right of Throne of Kings, but you wish to be reminded of when the tournament final would begin. Ah, it's that time already? I was so preoccupied that I hadn't noticed. Rather than preoccupied, it was more like his brain was fried from the previous night's discussion. It was surprisingly easy for him to sit perfectly still for long periods due to his undead body not experiencing any of the discomfort that a human would have from doing the same. Barely a thought had gone through his mind the entire time. His gaze went to Sabos, who had stood ramrod straight at his side since Ainz sat down. Like some of the other NPCs, Sabos seemed to have inherited quite a bit of his parents' personality. What would he have to say about the previous night's discourse on justice, Sabos? Ainz said. I would have your opinion on a certain matter. I will endeavor to answer to the utmost of my ability, Ainz Summer. Ma, it's not that sort of question. Don't let it bother you too much. Ha. The butler's steely expression didn't soften in the slightest. Ines considered how to phrase his query. You spent a great deal of time in Rantle since we took over, he said. Based on your interactions with the people, do you believe that the Sorcerer's Kingdom is a just country? The people appear to be content with the peace brought about by your rule, Sabos replied, though it saddens me to say that most still haven't accepted the realities of their new lives. Do you mean to say that order is maintained through strength alone? That the justice of the Sorcerer's Kingdom is peace of the sword and nothing more? Not precisely, Ein Summer, but it would not be wrong to say that our strength is what makes everything that contributes to the stability of the city possible. Does that reflect positively on me as a king? Or does that make me little more than a despot in the eyes of the people? I believe that the people do not fully appreciate the depth of your benevolence, Ein Summer, Sabos said. At the same time, they are not being openly disrespectful. It pains me to say this, but the overall sentiment of the city folk remains at similar levels to their previous sovereign. Change comes slowly, however, so the sense that things aren't getting worse may mean that their regard towards you will improve in time. It's just as we discussed. Baroness Radnik had gone into far more detail as to why that was. As promised, for the benefit of Aura and Mare, she delivered a lengthy lecture about the foundations of justice, how it evolved as society did, and how culture and judicial systems were engineered to serve the needs of a country or at least enforce the order it desired. So even though we reduced crime rates and improved food security, the people think no differently of me than King Ramposa? The corner of the butler's eye twitched. He lowered his head apologetically. Forgive me, Ein Summer. I failed to articulate my thoughts properly. In terms of violent crime, the citizens appreciate the fact that it has dropped nearly nothing, but the most severe cases of violent crime in the area never occurred in the city in the first place. When it comes to petty crime, they similarly appreciate that levels have dropped significantly, but they feel that the penalties for crime in general are far too cruel. That was an unexpected twist. In return for reducing crime rates, he was being considered a cruel ruler. Personally, he didn't think that the punishments for crime in the Sorcerer's Kingdom were overly harsh. Back on Earth, convicted criminals had their assets seized by the government while the criminals themselves were reprocessed into nutrients for the algae farms. This effectively turned a societal liability into an asset, which pretty much everyone accepted as common sense. Of course, repurposing individuals, or, rather, their corpses, into productive undead assets was reserved for crimes warranting the death penalty. For everything else, perpetrators were fined and made to pay off their debts to society in some fashion. The problem most likely lay with the fact that the Sorcerer's Kingdom was perceived as a place where undead, fiends, and other evil beings ruled. Lady Zaradnik noted that cultural and religious views would tend to color every move that they made unfavorably as a result. Fixing that would take far, far more than what they were currently doing. I'm surprised that the bounty we've brought to local agriculture hasn't done more to shift public opinion in our favor, Ein said. According to Albedo, many parts of Riestais are on the verge of famine. I imagined that the people would be grateful for being spared that fate. As you know, Ein Summer, Sabos replied, Rantle is a center of trade. Though it may sound strange, the people of the city do not consider themselves part of the same society as the people in the country. I found that city folk tend to believe that they can toil and trade their way out of all adversity. Additionally, nearly every city dweller belongs to one guild or another, and each of those guilds serves as their members' respective community for life. The guilds regulate nearly every aspect of those lives, one could even say that they are societies in themselves. Eins nodded. I, too, have noticed this. Unlike the arcologies of Earth or the nation-states of its past, the countries of their new world were a complicated mess of competing power structures. Far from what one might find in a video game setting or so many fantasy stories, a kingdom was not even remotely a monolith. Kings did not hold absolute power, and what power they had was limited by the realities of their situation. No noble was in the exact same situation as the others. One couldn't know how they ruled their fiefs and played the games of power unless one was very familiar with the individual being scrutinized. Even their subjects weren't as simple as they seemed, and certainly weren't anything like the oppressed innocents or unwashed masses that a person from Suzuki Satoru's world might imagine them to be. In the cities, as Seiboss mentioned, the guilds were effectively the true rulers. Ainz had spared them next to no thought when considering the future of the Sorceress Kingdom. The Adventurer Guild was the only one he was interested in, and was later shocked to find out how important they were. The guilds dictated every facet of their members' lives, deciding who was and wasn't allowed to work, how much one should charge for said work, and even what one was allowed to do outside of work. How a member dressed, who they could interact with, who they could marry, and even things that seemed entirely pointless like the times of the day when one was allowed to pray to their gods and which gods were appropriate to worship in the first place. In short, the guilds had an astonishing amount of control and fought tooth and nail to keep kings, nobles, and even the temples from interfering with their business. They were far from harmless and didn't hesitate to destroy those who challenged their regulations and ignored their influence, hiring thugs, arsonists, assassins, and bards to do their bidding. Even a seemingly innocuous tailors' guild could grow powerful enough to hold entire countries hostage and bend sovereigns to their will. Indeed, the status quo in any given location was determined by how the power struggle between the sovereign, the aristocratic establishment or whatever equivalent occupied their position, the guilds, and the temples. Added to that were external threats like monsters, wilderness tribes, criminal organizations, and mercenary bands who could just as easily act as bandits, raiders, and pirates. Ainz could only scratch his head, wondering how anything like a country managed to exist under normal circumstances. And people expect me to champion true justice in a place like this? Give me a break. You'd figure people would be happy enough over having a safe place to live. If I may ask, Ainz Summer, Seiboss said, how will the people be punished? Ainz looked up at Seiboss in confusion. The butler seemed tense, the lines of his aged face visibly tightening as he awaited the answer to his question. Punished? There have been many calls for punitive measures against the citizens by Nazarik's denizens, Seiboss replied. Not everyone agrees on what should be done, but even I find it hard to stomach how your goodwill towards the people is so often taken for granted and even twisted. Well, I'm not exactly pained by it. You mentioned earlier that time should see public sentiment growing to favor the new rule, and I believe you are correct. Public order remains at acceptable levels and no one is starving. It would be better for us to address the underlying causes for any future discontent. The tension in Seiboss' expression melted away. What was he expecting him to do? Ainz Summer is wise, the butler said. As the leader of the supreme beings, guiding the Sorcerer's Kingdom must be a trivial matter. Ainz wasn't sure what running a guild in Yggdrasil had to do with running a country, but a suitable response to the undeserved praise eluded him. All he could really do was bide his time and hope that Albedo and the others could figure something out. However, that, too, would probably be attributed to the wisdom of some unfathomable phenom of a ruler called Ainz Ul-Gaun. The fabric of his robe rustled as he stirred from his throne. Seiboss fell into step behind Ainz as he made his way out of the throne room. Have you enjoyed the tournament and its festivities, Seiboss? Yes, Ainz Summer, Seiboss replied. The experience has been quite enlightening. Is that so? Well, that's good to hear. Though he said that, Ainz wondered if the NPCs would truly learn anything from it. The combat drills he had suggested had grown into something far greater he could anticipate, yet there was a disappointing predictability to the tournament's outcomes. The only exceptions were the fights in which Albedo participated. He had hoped that the Guardian Overseer's preparations would drive a similar change in her fellow NPCs, yet nothing happened. Albedo's adjustments to her equipment brought her victory after victory, yet the vanquished remained unshaken. If anything, he had the feeling that they were convinced that Albedo was in the wrong as she had deviated from the intent of her creator. In the grand foyer beyond the throne room doors, they were joined by Solution and Shizu. From there, Ein stepped through the nearby teleportation gate. The scenery shifted to the sunlit grove that housed the teleportation gate on the 6th floor, where he was immediately assailed by the scents and sounds of the nearby festival. At least I can call this part of the tournament a success, I think. The non-combatant population of Nazarick had come up with the festival, intending for it to be a tournament in itself. As with the intended combat drills where Ein stated his desire to witness what the NPCs had learned over the past few years, Nazarick's household staff pitted their skills against one another through the displays of artisanry found in every stall. As he strolled along the festival lane, Ein idly waved in acknowledgement to the endless cheers and greetings he received from Nazarick's denizens. His attention, however, was focused on the competition itself, namely, the dishes, crafts, and other products arrayed before him. Slowly, but surely, the notion that the household NPCs were improving evaporated. These are all recipes from Yggdrasil, aren't they? He was certain it was the case. Though the variety was nothing short of astonishing, everything was a recipe that the guild's crafting team had collected from one game event or the other. A pair of homunculus maids curtsied as Ain's turned to approach their stand, the addictive yakisoba vendor that Aura favored. "Welcome, Ein Summer," Decrement, one of the homunculus maids running the stand, greeted him with a bright smile. "Have you come to try our yakisoba? It's super popular." Is that even possible? There were so many different races in Nazarick that it was difficult to imagine a type of food that was universally popular. Could it be that this food was the unifying element that could act as the foundation of the Sorceress Kingdom's justice? "I was simply curious about what made this dish so popular," Ein said. "How did you make it?" "The noodles are made from Midgard brawn wheat," Decrement replied. "We've stir-fried some Jotunheim ice lettuce, Shantak eggs, and slices of Emperor unicorn steak. Oh, and LRF was added, of course." LRF, A. LRF was a mysterious ingredient that went into pretty much every cooked recipe past mid-tier. According to the item description, it made everything taste better. Did such a thing exist in their new world? "It seems that you've sourced your ingredients from the treasury," Ein said. "Have you considered using local materials?" "The cooks have experimented with various ingredients imported from the outside as Ein's Summer suggested," Decrement said, "but they were all found to be greatly inferior to what we already have in Nazarick. We wouldn't dare tarnish the tournament festival with poor quality food." "In that case, what about bringing this sort of festival to the people of the Sorceress Kingdom?" "I feel that they are not worthy of such blessed traditions, Ein Summer. It's doubtful that they would properly appreciate what we've done here." So much for learning. As far as he could tell, what they had learned from him encouraging them to learn was that they didn't need to learn. They considered everything in Nazarick to be both inherently and practically superior, and so they chose to compete using recipes that produced superior, but set, results. To top it all off, they were jealously protective of what they had. Much like the Floor Guardians and the other combat-oriented NPCs, they stubbornly refused to change and saw no reason to do so. What they were and what they had would always be just as their creators intended and therefore perfect for what they were supposed to be. All of their ambitions and aspirations similarly revolved around being what they were. Ein saw his friends' creations as their children, so he wanted to see them become more than that. No matter what he did, however, nothing truly changed. One might point out that Cocytus had gone out of his way to conquer the races around the Great Lake in Tob, but his settings characterized him as something like a daimyo from Japan's feudal era. Conquest and collecting vassals wasn't something that he could do in Yggdrasil, but it was possible now and he jumped at the first opportunity presented before him. By the same token, Shaltir had taken so well to her role as the Sorceress Kingdom's Minister of Transportation, because it fell within the realm of one of her domains as a cleric. Albedo's settings set her up as the Great Tomb of Nazarick's supremely capable administrator, which translated well to her duties in the Sorceress Kingdom. He hadn't given up hope, however. Everything suggested that what Nazarick already possessed was overwhelmingly superior when push came to shove, so he couldn't reasonably expect the NPCs to be inspired by what they saw. Since that was the case, He decided not to stress over it and instead focused on aspects that promised change regardless of experience. Eins Sama. Aura's voice turned his attention away from the yakisoba stand and to the festival lane where the twins were rapidly closing on his position. Ukuba Kushigama's children were a large part of what he pinned his hopes on for change and growth. Being children was a part of their settings, and children inevitably changed, didn't they? At least he assumed that they would. It would be more than a bit disturbing if they remained as they were forever. Good afternoon, Eins Sama. Bringing up the rear was Shiltir, who was sporting her black parasol, accompanied by Baroness Zaradnik. The young noblewoman lowered her head as she dipped into a smooth curtsy. Good afternoon, Your Majesty, she said. Thank you so very much for last night. Shiltir cast a sidelong glance at her vassal. Last night? What happened last night? The thing that you purposely avoided attending, my lady. Oh, Shiltir sighed, that. You should pursue more titillating events to vaguely refer to. I won't be doing anything titillating with His Majesty while Lord Mayor and Lady Aura are present, my lady. Oh, so you admit that? Eins cleared his throat. How was everyone's day? He asked. It felt very productive, Your Majesty, Lady Zaradnik answered with a smile. I was far more confident in my studies after our discussion last night. Is that so? How encouraging to hear. I look forward to seeing the fruit of your efforts. Frankly, he had no idea what he had done to boost her confidence. He certainly didn't feel very confident afterwards. As long as the world of his new existence avoided the fate of Earth, however, he would count his momentary mental trials as a trivial price to pay. Aura and Mayor lined up at the stand to pick up an early dinner. Eins turned his attention to Sabos. There's no need to stand on ceremony, Sabos, he said. Why not get some food for yourself, as well? I appreciate your kind regard, Eins Sama, Sabos replied, but that would hardly be proper as your butler. Eins glanced at the Baroness, who had distanced herself from the cluster of NPCs who had gathered around him. After several years in their new world, he had a pretty good idea of what butlers were supposed to be like. Sabos was a butler in the sense that he could buttle, but the closest thing to a highly qualified professional butler in Nazarick was actually Albedo. The same could be said for Nazarick's maids, their existence was just as fantastical as anything else from Yggdrasil. No one dared to call any members of the Sorcerer King's royal household out on their strange behavior, however. In fact, it appeared that several noble households were trying to emulate the Pleiades. He wasn't sure how he felt about battle maids running all over the place, but at least there wouldn't be any combat butlers. Eins took a leisurely stroll through the stalls, savoring the final day of the tournament festival. Aside from its traditional Japanese feeling, he didn't think that a similar event held by the Sorcerous Kingdom's citizens would be overshadowed by much. In many aspects, they would do better. The more, the merrier, as the old saying went. If the NPCs don't feel like doing it, I'm sure I could get the locals to organize something. It wasn't as if they didn't have festivals. What they had, however, was limited in variety. Broadly speaking, there were 3 types. The most common were market days, which happened in the towns every week or so. He only barely considered them festivals, however. People came from the rural regions to purchase tools and necessities that one couldn't usually find in a village. It was mostly a business affair that couldn't even be compared to a city market on a normal day. Still, it was a regular event that could potentially be leveraged for other things. Holidays, or, rather, holy days, were the second most frequent event that the people participated in. Once again, festivities that focused on entertainment were limited, and one could say that they were a series of religious observances that the people followed. The suppressed state of the faith of the Four, which the majority of humans in the Sorcerous Kingdom still believed in, made things especially dour, even though he had never once instructed anyone to interfere with religion in the country. Lastly, was a true festival celebrating the harvest. This was especially the case now that the agricultural industry was being supported by Mayor's magic. Unfortunately, Each was a local celebration held in the rural villages and couldn't realistically become any larger than they already were. The way festivals worked in the Sorcerous Kingdom was vastly different from what he remembered as Suzuki Satoru. In his old world, there were countless holidays that purportedly came from every culture on Earth. They were marked by new product releases and sales of various goods depending on the occasion, and one's feed was bombarded by an endless parade of marketing campaigns. While he couldn't hope to match the reach and efficacy of the megacorporations, Ainz had hoped to at least mass-market the handful of ventures he had spearheaded. Unfortunately, the natives seemed to be nearly impervious to any marketing that wasn't done in person. There was simply too great a gap between their common sense and that of Earth's population. Does the Sorcerous Kingdom need an official marketing department? Most of the NPCs don't really think about promoting my stuff unless I specifically tell them to. Albedo, especially. He had a feeling that if he added an anonymous suggestion about using the Sorcerous Kingdom's resources to market personal side projects, Albedo's reaction to such an individual would grind his bones to powder. His ego was already on the verge of shattering after discussing justice with Baroness Zaradnik, so it was probably best to kick that particular can down the road. Eventually, they made their way into the arena and to Ainz's VIP booth with its expansive black pavilion. A small commotion drew his attention to the stands just outside. To his surprise, he found a visibly upset Shaltia with her back turned to Baroness Zaradnik. They're fighting? That's not something I'd have expected. Between Shaltia's haughty stubbornness and Lady Zaradnik's near unflappable accommodation of her liege, it was hard to imagine. Even now, the young noblewoman's expression was unreadable. Ainz went over to see what was wrong, but he was unable to gain any clues as to what was going on before he came before them. "This is a rare sight," he said. "Rather than that, I don't think I've ever seen you two fight before. There are more than a few things that we do not agree on, Your Majesty," the Baroness said, "but I feel that this particular concern is rather one-sided." "What is it?" Ainz asked. "It's unbelievable, Ainz Summer." Shaltia turned to clutch at his robe tearfully. "Ludmilla is going to leave me for that gorilla." "Huh? I never once suggested that, my lady," Baroness Zaradnik replied. "Oh, but it's as clear as day," Shaltia said. Ludmilla gazes at her so intensely. "And have you all of the notes she's taken on her? She's become obsessed. After every one of her matches, it's always Albedo this and that." "I have notes from your fights, as well," the Baroness noted. "But you have 10 times the notes on Albedo," Shaltia said. "No, I wouldn't be surprised if it was 50 times more. And the amount of detail they contain on every part of her body is utterly obscene." "Should that not be expected, my lady? She is a warrior, after all. Cocytus is a warrior, too. You don't have nearly as much on him as Albedo. Despite Lord Cocytus carrying a halberd all over the place, he is a kensei. I am not a sword user. We have been over this before. Ainz Summer, please do something." What am I supposed to do, exactly? As far as he could tell, Shaltia was just being jealous. That in itself was a good sign, since it showed that Shaltia valued her vassal enough that she didn't want to lose her. However, he couldn't draw any correlation between Lady Zaradnik's study of Albedo's fights in the tournament and her dumping Shaltia for the Guardian Overseer. Did Albedo even care about such things? Likely not. Ainz placed a skeletal hand on Shaltia's head. The hysterical vampire immediately went still. "Ma, calm down, Shaltia," he said. "I doubt that Zaradnik Dono would so easily leave you, especially after everything you've been through together. You should focus on your big fight, instead." "Okie." Once Shaltia shuffled off to the arena's underbelly, Ainz returned to his throne-like seat. The stand slowly filled as the beginning of the match grew near. Many members of the Sorcerous Kingdom's royal court joined him at the pavilion, though he figured that it would still be too awkward for Pandora's actor to be present when Lady Zaradnik was around. The Baroness did ask after him for some unknown reason, but Ainz made the excuse that the tournament didn't suit the royal treasurer's tastes and he was busy taking care of important matters elsewhere. The crowd fell still as the sky over the arena darkened. A trio of spotlights beamed down from the towers high above. They converged on Aura, who was announcing the match as usual. The Dark Elf Ranger smiled brightly as she swept her gaze over the stands. It's been a long journey, but we finally arrived at our tournament's grand finale. I hope you're all fired up. In answer, the arena erupted into a chorus of cheers. Two of the spotlights separated from Aura, circling the sands of the arena as she prepared to announce the two finalists. Aura raised her left hand. In the black corner, coming in with a perfect streak of victories from the very beginning, is the Guardian Overseer, Albedo. One of the wandering spotlights fell upon the black-armored figure of Albedo, who stood unmoving with Bardiche in hand. The response from the crowd was similarly subdued. Ayn suspected that most of Nazarick didn't approve of Albedo's unorthodox preparations and were thus disinclined from cheering for her. In the red corner, Aura raised her right hand. Also coming in with a perfect streak of victories, is the floor guardian of the first, second, and third floors, Shaltir Bloodfallen. The final spotlight fell upon the Shaltir, who stood across the arena from Albedo with her pipette lance in hand. Aura spoke through the modest reception for the second contestant. Who will finally have their perfect record broken? Who will receive the favor of Ayn Summer? Hang on to your seats, because this is going to be a match for the ages.